Okay, hi everyone. Thanks very much for coming. Welcome to the first Political Studies Association Teaching and Learning Network webinar on teaching politics online. My name is Donna Smith from the Open University, and I'm co-chair of the Teaching and Learning Network. Now, we know that most universities have had to move their teaching offer online due to the current coronavirus pandemic. And this has led to challenges such as getting to grips with technology, understanding online teaching, and creating an academic community at a distance, as well as some opportunities, of course, such as the chance to do things differently, build on best practice, and reach students asynchronously. So now, I guess we can call the crisis response phase has passed. We thought it's a good time to reflect on best practice in teaching online, as it's possible that many of us will be teaching more online in the future, either in response to the pandemic or because teaching and learning models and student needs change. So today's session is called How Are We Going to Get Through This? By Simon Usherwood from the University of Surrey. There's been lots of talk about supporting students, but we also need to think about how we support each other and look after ourselves. So in this webinar, Simon will be thinking about the general strategies and tactics you might employ to keep it all under control. So we're due to finish in about an hour's time, and there will be time for questions. Either myself or my colleague John Craig, the co-chair of the network, will be moderating the chat, so do post your queries there. And Jamie Roberts from the PSA is also on hand in case we have any technical issues. Please do note the session's recorded and make sure you're muted for now if you're not already. Now, you may have noticed that some of you might be called Jamie Roberts on the system rather than your own name, slight technical hitch. So if you do want to kind of change it to your own name, please just do so on the screen using the little ellipse button on, I think, the top right of your box. So, okay, without further ado, please welcome Simon Usherwood.
Thank you very much, Donna. I would say, can you hear me at the back? But there is no back, just as there is no front. I'm shocked and slightly scared because I thought when I was asked if I would do this that maybe we'd have maybe 10 or 20 people who would be interested, people I know, the people from the group. And here we are with nearly 60 people, which I think is a really encouraging sign, but again is also a sign of quite where we all are. So what I want to try and do is try and talk about some different issues, but also try and do something that's a bit more interactive rather than just me sitting here and talking to you. So with that in mind, I'm guessing you've all used Zoom at some point. If not, you've worked it out by now. If you have questions or queries, just stick things in the chat, and I'm really happy to pick that up as we go along. But also what I'm going to do is just send you a link in the chat. I've made some Google documents which will access at different points, but it's just so that you can access those when you are told to, so we can get a little bit of feedback in a more structured kind of way. And I'll keep that link open for you to access after the seminar, and I'll share it with the organisers as well. Okay, right, let's find a PowerPoint presentation for a couple of pictorial slides, and then I will share that with you as we go along. Okay. First thing is I've changed the title slightly because rather than saying how are you going to get through this, I've called it how are we going to get through this, because this is much an issue for me as it is for you. And what I want to try and do is in this session is to think a little bit about how we've got to with this situation, what we might learn from it, and then thinking about what there is to come next, because I think that's the next big challenge that we might think about. So it's about making sense. And for those of you who've read the piece that Donna and John kindly reposted on the Learning and Teaching blog, one of the things I think has been very useful is doing things like this has been very helpful for me to try and make sense about what I've been doing and what I might do as we go along. So key points is all got appropriate refreshments. I'm going to tell you about one of my colleagues in a department that may or may not be a law department, who I was talking to at a Viva this week, who was telling me that her bank organises regular events to share on Zoom. They have little classes and do things like that, which all sounded very nice. And I was asking what bank that might be, since my bank doesn't do that. It turns out it's Coutts. So that's, I think, telling you something about law rather than anything else. But what I'd like you to do is the politics version of the Coutts seminar, which is if you go to that link, which is in the chat, if you go to the first activity, which you will have access to, I want you to make a meme, if that's all right with you. So if you go to the thing that's called Activity 1, I've given you some links and meme generators. I'd just like you to play around and make a little meme about how this is all going right now. And then you can post it in that document when you've had a go with it. Let's see if I can post the link again for those who've come later. Yeah, so those of you who come later should be able to now see that link that I put in the chat. Activity 1, this is something that I've done with my students this semester. I had already flipped my teaching with my first years on teaching the EU, and I thought that this would be a useful way of getting them to engage a bit. It largely transpired that it wasn't the best way to learn about the EU through memes, but rather it turned out to be quite engaging for them in what they've got. Let me see again in the meeting. So the reason for doing this is that this is a useful little activity in terms of getting people to visualize their ideas, think about the material that they have, but also how it relates to the material as a whole and their learning. And for me, that's been one of the key things, that we've had a whole series of rapid decisions that we've had to engage with, to deal with, that have been very sudden, very disconcerting and disorientating. And so really it's about trying to get a grasp on that, looking at people's faces. Oh, there we are, we've already got. This is all anonymous. And this has the advantage that this is a technique which works very simply in terms of instantaneously being able to see what people are doing and putting things together. You can see that everyone is clicking links. I'm going to give you a minute to have a play around with that. When you've had a go with that, when you've posted something, you might also want to do the first set of questions. If you go back to that landing page that I sent you in the link, there's a block of questions, question 1. If you want to just add responses to that, you can do that too. We can jump straight to that if memes really aren't your thing, which is highly conceivable as we go along. already we're learning that Donna is a Sean Bean fan. Sean Bean meme fan. May not be the same thing. In terms of making sense of how we've got here, I think one of the key things that Donna has already mentioned is that this has been done in incredibly short order. And those first set of questions that you have got and that you're putting in answers to in the next minutes are precisely the kinds of things that require some reflection and some stepping back from in order to try and make sense of it. Because I think one of the things that is increasingly evident to all of us is that this isn't just going to be something we have to deal with for the rest of this semester, for those of us still teaching. It's also going to be something that is going to be a medium-term change to the way that we operate, and particularly thinking about what comes through for the autumn. And we're going to talk about the autumn last section of this seminar. So let's have a look and see how we're doing on other teaching evaluations. If let's have a look at the questions. Some responses already. So we've got quite a few memes going on. For those of you who've not yet had a try of the questions, have a quick go of the questions. Responding. And in a sec, I will show you your responses just to see how you think you are doing and use that as a kind of a start. Because I think one of the key messages that I want to try and reinforce, and which you're already doing exactly the kind of thing that we would want, is about sharing and discussing the challenges that we face. And I think one of the big dangers in all of this is endless reinventing of wheels when there is already a lot of good practice out there, a lot of helpful practice, and importantly, a lot of people who are very happy and willing to share that across their institutions, across disciplines, and across HE as a whole. And certainly for me, that's always been one of the things I particularly liked about learning and teaching, is that it is a very sharing and open kind of place in terms of materials and ideas and practice. So let's, who's turned up late. Anna, if you follow the link that I've just put in the chat, you will be able to go there. Okay, we've got about 20 people who've done the questions. So let's have a try of screen and seeing what we've got. So, some tentative responses, which will add up. So most of you think you're doing quite well, which is good. Nobody's thinking they're doing particularly badly, which is, I think, a good sign. And again, we have to be aware of our sample, the kind of people who will be interested in a seminar like this are probably the kind of people who think they're doing okay. Questions that I asked, the second question I was thinking about the most significant difficulty, we again got quite a range of answers. So it's the difficulty of not being in the same place as students, lack of institutional support are the two big ones that are there. So one is a kind of a practicalities question of suddenly my students aren't in the same room or necessarily the same time zone as me, and that makes it much more difficult. And secondly, I think one of the consistent themes that come through from you, but also from talking with other colleagues, is this challenge of institutions coming up with very high-level directives, which then have to be translated into practice. And sometimes that practice is achieve in short order, and your normal channels of communications might be ones that are also difficult to operationalize. That if you're thinking about your learning and teaching units, for example, they have been exceptionally busy, just as your colleagues or indeed yourselves who have been involved in helping people change suddenly are deluged with queries and questions, which means that they don't have so much time for individuals or indeed for themselves as they move on. Those two points really are critical ones to start off with, because I think they really speak to the challenges that we will face, because those two factors are going to be key ones as we move through into the longer term adaptation that takes place. We'll have to think a bit about the strategies that then hopefully some of the things we can do as an association, as a group of colleagues, are ones which can be helpful. I also asked a question practically about, what is it that you found useful in terms of tips, because I'm just interested in what people pick up from this process so far. If we look at the questions, it's things such as adaptation, connection, time management, keeping it simple, definitely. And I think this point about doing it badly for now, I'm not sure doing it badly, but just getting through is a part of it, but thinking about how that will change in the autumn. And not panicking, I think, is also a good thing to do as well. For me, one of the things I think that has been helpful in this has been thinking about the challenge, not so much one as coming out of the blue, but rather as a different kind of set of challenges, the ones that we normally face when it comes to teaching. And here, really, I think we're back into a lot of the things that we often have to deal with, that we're often under constraints in terms of timetabling, of rooming, of resource that can be provided in support of what we've done. And just kind of looking at the tiles there, I can see various colleagues that I've collaborated with on informal projects in and around teaching that has been very helpful in expanding the range of what I can do. But a lot of that has been driven by constraints rather than by opportunities. And I'm guessing that for a lot of you, you have the same experience, that the things you would like to do are not necessarily the same as the things that you do. And instead, you have to work around the options as they exist. And in that sense, this situation is not so different from those kinds of challenges. Yes, the scale, the speed of adaptation that you have to provide is still something that is very marked and impactful, but is still at the same time something that falls within the same kind of remit. I think if we recognize that, then we can potentially make more sense of this and move along in terms of our practice and developing what we do. If we want to tutorial form, because why not? That. What's happened, we don't need to worry about loo roll anymore. But yeah, this is maybe where we are. Maybe take, but why not? And actually, it could clearly be worse, no matter quite where we are. So what I want to think about here is about stressing the extent to which we have factors that help us to work through that. And with that in mind, if you go back to your landing page, the group that I have set up, and I think everyone's here, but I'll just put it one more time in the chat for those who've come late. If you go through and if you try the second block of questions, so if you go to the file called questions 2, there are some more questions which are a bit more prospective as we go along. And let's see what it is that you come up with on that front. This is, I think, one of the challenges that I certainly have faced, is that in terms of learning about new skills, it's been really good to help for me to practice these kind of things. So with you, I'm practicing some things of trying multiple pages at the same time. I've made some assumptions about what you will and won't do in terms of paying attention to my instructions. Somebody's already on activity 2, which I wasn't going to do for about another 15 minutes, but there you are. You can do activity 2 at any time, by the way. But here, I think it's understanding about the way that that works. And partly because I thought, you know, people do what they tend to do. Maybe your mind drifts, that, you know, if people go and do things ahead of time, is that a problem? No, not really. And if it were, then I'd find another way of trying to do it. So again, with the word of the day, and I've been in a seminar all morning where we've been talking about resilience as a key concept that will be emerging in various areas of politics. Resilience is a core part of learning and teaching in very many ways, that it's about adapting to ever-changing situations, both in the short and in the longer term, and finding answers and ways through the work for us. So, this one I'm going to be interested in, because these questions in block 2 are about the autumn. Again, just to be clear, I think the reason that we need to think about the autumn is twofold. Firstly, we are practically likely to be under some kind of lockdown characteristics and situations in the autumn, maybe minor, maybe just kind of limitations on physical co-location or social distancing within classrooms. There may be restrictions on travel that make it hard for non-UK students, or wherever you are, people from other countries, being able to come into the classroom. But also, I think it's going to be a longer term issue that we might well have students who may be able to come, but who choose not to come. And our institutions might well be saying, well, we need to help those students continue to access learning, and it would be very cynical to say that that was just about fees. but clearly fees are part of it, that we need to be thinking about universities' income streams, that if we can provide the same kind of opportunities for learning for students who are off campus as we can on campus, then that is good for students, and it's also good for chief financial officers, should you have one in your institution, which you do. Let's see where we are on the questions. We've got quite a lot of people. We've still got people doing questions 1, but so let's have a look and see whether you think it's all going well. No, it's the main answer. Most of you don't know what you're doing. Why is that? The big one is this first one, which is institutions haven't made decisions. You know, 3/4 of you are saying that institution hasn't made decisions on basic features. I know that that's true for my institution. We have a departmental plan that is ready to go, but we lack decisions at the institutional level about what the fee regime might be, what the requirements might be, restrictions on classes, maximum numbers in rooms, things like that. You know, we're still quite early on in the process. When we don't have that kind of clarity, it becomes difficult to make the final kind of decisions. Quite a lot of people say, I haven't had time to work on this yet. Fair enough. Surprisingly, 1/3 of you still haven't been told what you're going to be teaching, or maybe not surprisingly. This is always one of the mysteries of teaching allocation, is when does teaching get allocated? I know people who know what they're teaching all through next year and have done for months and months. Equally, I know people who find out very shortly beforehand what the situation is. We've got maybe 1/3 of you who say you've lacked sufficient information. So it's interesting that you've got quite a few people who said that you haven't reviewed yet what there is. But the other features have been relatively minor. But again, our challenge here is that we're operating in a situation where we lack institutional framework and structure. So let's see who you've talked to. Lots of people. So most of you talk to people in your department, or people elsewhere in the institution. Surprisingly, given that you're all in this seminar, only half of you have talked to people outside of your institution. Maybe 1/4 of you have talked to students. Slightly more have talked to people who you're locked down with, or friends and family. I thought about disaggregating that, but let's see. In terms of the practicalities, the concerns, the biggest one is expectations of improved standards by the institution, and that's kind of half the responses, those 2 categories. The other big ones are the volume of teaching you've got and not knowing how many students. And clearly, if student numbers are in the process of shifting quite markedly, that does make it much more difficult. But for me, I think this question of improved standards, the expectations that everyone is likely to have, is a real concern. That I think students have been very understanding of the crash conversion that we have done back in March, the limited scope that we have to make it work really well or optimally. But at the point that we're coming back, we might well find ourselves in a situation where students say, you've had all summer, you've had the experience of the spring, and now is the time at which you can demonstrate that you really have got on top of this. Institutions likewise might well have the same kind of view. I know that for us, we've been told that module evaluations this year won't be considered at all. They'll still be collected because they're helpful for feedback, but they won't be part of annual appraisals or things like that. That won't happen next year, I'm very certain. And if you're in a similar situation, I would imagine that's the same for you too. So in terms of being attractive to students, being able to say we're on a very clear program of how we're going to deliver our teaching is clearly a part of that process. And so the university has multiple motivations for you to get better. And actually, I think for you as well, you might well feel that you've tried some different things, and it's important now to kind of move to something that's a more mature, rounded kind of practice.